A dry tank and a thirsty heart. The sun wasn't much more than a pale smear over the bluffs when I saddled up that morning. It was one of those late August days when the air feels thin and brittle, like the whole prairie is holding its breath. Well, I'd promised myself I'd check that far windmill before the heat settled in, so I eased Rusty into a trot and headed toward the back pasture. The grass was short, the draws were dusty, and even the meadowlarks sounded tired. I'd been watching that windmill for a week. It had been slowing down, groaning a little each day, and the cattle were starting to bunch up around the tank. I told myself it was just the heat, just the season, just the way things go. But deep inside, I knew something wasn't right. So I figured I'd better ride out there and take a look. For sure, I'd be back for a second cup of coffee. When I topped that last rise, my stomach dropped. The tank was bone dry. Not a shimmer, not a muddy ring, not even a damp shadow. Just cracked earth and a few confused heifers bawling at the emptiness. And there the windmill stood, like a tired old sentinel, blades barely twitching in the still air. Well, I felt the frustration rise even before I swung off the saddle. It came quick, hot, and sharp. I muttered at the windmill first, then at the weather, then at the bearings that don't seem to hold up like they used to. I kicked a clump of dirt and blamed the drought. I blamed the cows for being too stubborn to wander to the next tank. Truth is, I blamed the Lord too, though I didn't say it out loud. It was more of a quiet grumble in the back of my mind, the kind that sneaks in when you're tired and thirsty, feeling like life ought to be easier than it is. I didn't shake my fist at heaven, but I sure wasn't offering any praise either. I knelt beside that intake pipe, brushing away weeds and mud. The sun was climbing and sweat trickled down my back. The pipe was clogged with silt, so I got out my pocket knife and began digging, fussing under my breath. The cattle pressed in behind me, their hot breath impatient. I felt like I had a whole congregation of critics watching me fail. As I worked, a thought slipped in. Quiet, unwelcomed, but true. Son, the real dry tank ain't out here. It's the one you keep inside. Well, I froze for a moment, knife in hand. It wasn't a voice exactly, but it was close enough to stop me cold. I realized that I had been running on empty for a long time, praying less, worrying more, letting small frustrations pile up like tumbleweeds against a fence. Well, I cleared the last of the mud from the pipe and sat back on my heels. The windmill gave a slow, creaking groan, then another. The blades shuddered, caught a faint breeze, and began to turn. I watched, hardly daring to hope. The pump rod thumped once, twice, and then it settled into a steady rhythm. A moment later, some water spilled from the spout, First just a trickle, then a stream, and then a full cold gush that splashed against the dry metal and pooled at the bottom of the tank. The cattle surged forward, pushing and jostling, their tongues lapping greedily. I stood there with my boots getting wet, feeling something inside me loosen. The anger drained away, the blame, the frustration, the quiet accusation I'd been carrying toward God. They all just seemed to wash out with that first rush of water. I leaned against the windmill tower and let the moment settle. The prairie was still dry, the heat still rising, and the chores were still waiting. Nothing about the world had changed, but something in me had. I felt the Lord's presence in that dusty pasture as surely as if He stood right there beside me. Not scolding, not shaking His head, just offering water to a thirsty man who hadn't even known how dry he'd become. Then I got to thinking about Israel in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 17, grumbling at Moses, doubting God's presence and asking, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Oh boy, I'd ask that same question in my own way. And just like at Rephidim, God answered with mercy instead of judgment. Water from a rock, grace from a windmill, enough for the cattle and enough for me. I looked up the tower at the blades humming in the breeze. Music to my soul. I wiped my hands on my jeans and swung back into the saddle. And as I rode toward home, the prairie didn't look quite so brittle. The sun felt less harsh. And my heart, well, my heart, it wasn't full, but it wasn't empty anymore either. It had just enough water to keep me going. Just enough mercy to trust again.